one of the things that I realized in the course of a very long career was that there was very little representation when it came to who spends time in the outdoors and who doesn't, primarily, I think, focused almost exclusively on a majority white, upper middle class, socially mobile majority population. And as I started thinking about how I might be able to shift the emphasis of my work to include more people who look like me and look less like our customer base, I shifted my interest in persuasive communication from sales and marketing to journalism. And through the course of that career, I've become a storyteller. And also with my interest in outdoor recreation, focus of my work is to try to convince a increasingly emerging population that include people of color to invest not only in outdoor recreation, but environmental conservation with the primary interest in improving the circumstances of climate change that is impacting the entire population as a whole. And so with that, we have the opportunity to engage in a broad but very local conversation about how we can hopefully engage, especially our youth, to become involved in the issues of climate change mitigation through communication. And I think that a big part of that is also going to be our ability to mobilize that emerging population to be more engaged and impactful in our efforts to turn the tide of our warming planet. I'd like to introduce my panel this morning. I have the pleasure of introducing to you several distinguished members of the youth population that is going to lead this charge. To begin, on my right is Nadia Elmes Makosky, who joined the Representative Hong staff in November of 2020. She previously ran as a candidate for Wisconsin State Senate and served as the Sustainable Madison Commission. She also serves as the chair of the Young Democrats of Wisconsin 2nd Congressional District. She is writing in the Wisconsin Green New Deal and is a consultant for a political campaign on climate justice and sustainability. I'm also joined by Stephanie Jeneth Salgado, who 5 years ago moved to Madison from Honduras with her family and is a junior majoring in political science and environmental studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 2019, she was appointed to the state's Climate Change Task Force, which advises Governor Tony Evers on the most pragmatic ways to mitigate the effects of climate change. As a student at Memorial High School, Salgado contributed to the Green Card Youth Voices and co-founded the nonprofit Youth Climate Action team and is a member of the Wisconsin Student Climate Action Coalition. And finally, last but not least, Benjamin Backer, who launched the American Conservation Coalition, the AAC, in July of 2017. AAC is a nonprofit organization dedicated to market-based environmental reforms. Through AAC, Becker helps to unite Americans on pro-environmental reforms and change the narrative when it comes to the environment. He has been awarded the GRIS 50, the Forbes 30 under 30, the Red Alert 30 under 30, and Britannica's 20 over 40. That's a lot of zeros. Becker grew up in Wisconsin and received a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington in the year 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, please meet my panel. Welcome to the stage. So I have several prepared questions, and I'd like to make sure that we open up our conversation to the audience. So if there's anything that you would like to ask in about 20 minutes of conversation, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone into the stage and we will call on you. But I hope that as we begin this conversation, we'll actually come up with not only questions, but some solutions to the many issues that we're discussing today. And I think that a great place to start is to ask ourselves, what are the keys to success of the effective climate change communication? How do we successfully communicate these important issues? I'm going to start by asking that question to Nadia. What do you think?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. So what are the keys to success? I mean, how do we create effective climate change communication?
I think from my work in the state legislature, government and policymakers kind of tend to operate in a place of gatekeeping information. So I think the first step in really, you know, at least for climate policy, communicating what needs to happen, making sure that we are democratizing information and that we are encouraging, you know, open access to communities that are most effective, that often are not included in decision-making processes is the first step. I think building agency within those communities is also incredibly important, making sure that people feel empowered to solve the issues that affect them and understand that their lived experience is the authority they need, right? You know, even I sitting here, there's incredible imposter syndrome that I have to fight and thinking, I don't know enough of the science behind climate change to really affect change, but it's really, if you have a stake in you know, this environmental crisis, you absolutely have the place to combat it and the voice to fight it. So I think agency, democratizing information and being very flexible in our messaging and understanding that kind of communicating climate change and climate policy in a way that appeals to different people is incredibly important.
Thank you. And I'll ask Benji that same question. What do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. One quick, kind of taking a step back, I grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin, and I did end up going to the other UW for undergrad. And let me tell you, as much as I hate to say it because I still live in Seattle, every time it's a Saturday and I wake up and I have a choice between two UW football games, I always still choose the Badgers to watch because I'm much more of a Badgers fan than even after spending 4 years in Washington. So it's an honor to be here, and my parents are grads, and so I'm just really honored to be here. I really think in terms of communication, one of the things that's lacking, and you mentioned this in the opening, is that there's a lack of diversity. There's a lack of diversity in terms of minority communities. There's also a lack of diversity in terms of the way that we communicate it from a political angle. And I grew up as a conservative activist in Northeast Wisconsin. And one of the things that I heard time and time again was that my peers who were conservative actually cared a lot about this issue, but no one really communicated it to them in a way that was authentic. And I think to Nada's point, we have a really important role to play as people who are interested in this crisis to communicate in a way that is authentic to each person, because people in Milwaukee have a different way of looking at it than Appleton, and in Appleton, people have a different way of looking at it than in New Orleans. And politically, people have a different way of looking at it. And I think we need to make sure that people feel bought in and people feel like they can actually tie themselves to the issue, because if we're going to get policy results on climate, we are going to need every single person in the room that we can of passing legislation, passing policies, but we also need those good ideas that come from these different communities. And I think that is incredibly vital. The other thing is, and I think that this is where young activists and kind of the climate change movement could do a better job, is we need to simplify it for people. And I think we've done a good job of doing that, but we can't oversimplify it. We can't make it so simple where people feel like it's just as easy as one solution, or 3 simple words, or just one simple mandate. It's a very complex problem. Climate change is very complex. It's global. Every single part of this country and every single part of this globe has a different stake in it, and every individual is going to deal with the effects in a different way. And so we need to simplify it so that people can understand it, because not all of us are going to care about what the climate policy says on page 67 of the UN climate report. But at the same time, we do need to make sure that we are adding some nuance to it in our conversations, so that when people are advocating for solutions, they aren't just doing it in a way that is not based in reality. So I think those are kind of 2 areas that I think we could communicate better, is including every voice in the conversation, as well as making it as nuanced and simple as possible, if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. Benji, thank you. And Stephanie, I'll ask you the same question.
The way I decide to approach effective climate communication is through storytelling. As simple as that may sound, storytelling is powerful. Stories are what compels you and what takes you back into your life of something, an experience that you have not experienced. And so, as I say today, the recommendations, or it may be my story of other people's story, that you listen and you find middle ground. My identities may be very different from a lot of you in this room, but that doesn't make me any different of a subject here in this planet Earth that is concerned about climate change. And through that, I talk about being realistic. When we talk about climate change, we have to understand the severity of how it's becoming. Many people talk about it in forums like this one, in conventions, but no action then happens. Why is that? Compromise, I understand, is very hard and difficult, but it's the only way to get advancement to what we need to be. And so I decide to use climate change and talk about climate change in a nonpartisan way. It's an issue. And just like Benji said, every voice has to be included in the conversation. But at the same time, it has to be equitable. Just as you heard as your keynote speaker, that equity is very important in the conversation. The environmentalism movement has been whitewashed, and it was Indigenous and Black people who first created it. And lastly, that goes to my last point of grassroots activists that have to be included in the conversation, not as to be tokenized, as being part of the picture for you to demonstrate how diverse your circle of influence is, but instead to be put in positions of power, positions of leadership, and decision makers that will make a difference.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that I neglected to do in advance of beginning the questions, I would like to hear from each of the panelists a little bit about their work. If you can take about 5 minutes each to tell the audience about what it is that you do, and specifically speaking to the notion of communication. How does your work help to communicate the interests of and the effectiveness of climate change? Benji, I'll have you start.
Yeah, awesome. And I also switched out my mask because I was correcting it the entire time I was talking. So hopefully this is better. So obviously I come at this from a perspective of we need conservative voices at the table to solve climate change, because if we only have 50% of the country working on climate change, we are getting 50% or less of the solutions that we need. And so what we're doing at ACC is we're building a movement of independent and right of center Americans who want action on climate, but maybe don't fall into the same organizations that they've had access to for the last few decades. And really my two goals as an individual and our two goals as an organization is to increase prioritization for Republicans on climate change and put the environment back into environmentalism. And what I mean by that is allow these people, whether they're Republican or conservative or liberal or Democrat or none of those, to feel like they can fight for environmentalism and climate change on behalf of the environment and feel connected to their work and feel connected to their love for the environment, their love for this planet that we all share, and is really the driving force behind fighting climate change. So what that means is grassroots activism and youth action are kind of the bread and butter of what we do. We're seeing across the globe right now that young people are leading the fight for climate action in a way that we've never seen before. I testified at Congress with Greta Thunberg back in 2019, and I was the oldest person on the panel. It was her, me, and two others. And I was 20, and I was the oldest person on the panel, and we're presenting to Congress. And so we're making a difference on this issue. Young people are truly making a difference on this issue. But the more we mobilize and the more we talk about it, to an earlier point that was made, the more we need to act. And so we're providing opportunities for our members who are part of hundreds of communities nationwide to write their elected officials, to write in their local newspapers, to hold rallies and hold events, to go out and actually do some of the change themselves, to be a part of the change. Because it's not enough just to talk about it. We have to go out and actually do the work. And we have to be building movements around that. People like Greta Thunberg and myself and so many in this room are doing that. We need to multiply that effort. And it has to be done in liberal circles, conservative circles, and every circle in between. This is the one issue that I really do believe Americans can unite on. Climate change affects us all. Environmental issues affect us all, and they don't care about what political party we are. And I, as a lifelong conservative activist, have so much in common with liberal people on this issue. And we're working together to come up with solutions in Congress and on the ground in grassroots areas. That is exactly what we need more of. We need more unity on this issue. We need more common ground. We need more compromise, because every single day that we don't take climate action is a day closer to a climate catastrophe. And we cannot wait for the perfect solution. We need to start taking steps now. And the best way to do that is to mobilize people and bring people into the conversation. And for me, that's bringing conservatives into the conversation, which is just one of many groups that needs to have a larger role.
Thank you. Stephanie, can I have you tell us a little bit about your work and your role in youth mobilization?
For sure. My name is Stephanie Janet Salgado Altamirano. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I was born and raised in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, which before you think I'm about to explain that it's a third world country, just know that it is culturally rich and diverse. I want you to remember my country when I say it out of my mouth as a tropical environment that inculcates a heartwarming heart into my people. Having said that, it is also the reality that because of colonization and systems of suffering, my country is suffering from gang violence, political instability, and corruption, and widespread extreme poverty. And for that reason, I didn't knew about the climate activists, about climate crisis until I came to this country. I came here when I was 14 years old. I was naive that my country was subjected to all these natural disasters, but little did I knew that we were contributing the least to this problem. I didn't knew. I was not informed. And I became an ESL student. And I say that as part of my story because it's essential, because it was not even my first language. I had to overcome that barrier in itself to understand this whole complex issue. I was told no by UW-Madison. I was told no to become a climate activist. I was told no to be an honor roll student. I was told no to be a climate and a class representative. But sooner or later, I made all those things happen for me. I became part of UW-Madison. I became a climate activist. I am an honor roll student from my high school, as indicted first as the only Latina student in honor roll in the honor society. And I say that with much pride, because it wasn't until my sophomore year of high school where there was no such thing as Green Club or environmental group in my high school where I created one. And through there, I was inspired, just like Benji, to see Greta Thunberg constantly and unapologetically say that we need change. We need to demand for change. So from there, we decided to meet with a bunch of students from Verona, Middleton, Madison, including West High School. We all got together and we said there is need to be a need for a climate strike. So we organized a climate strike with much pride. It took a long time of planning, but sooner or later, it was also rewarding. And from that organization and mobilization of youth, we created the Youth Climate Action Team, which is a nonprofit here at Madison that mobilizes youth to demand for change in a political level, but also on the streets. From there, I became a woman of color from a third world country that has become a co-founder of a nonprofit Youth Climate Action Team, co-author of the book Green Car Youth Voices, and the youngest member that served in the Governor Evers Climate Change Task Force. And with all of that, I still need to continue talking. I cannot let the mic go. So that's how I've been involved in the climate crisis.
Thank you. And finally, Nadia.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you for having me and being here today. It's so good to see all of you in person instead of the virtual screen. Thank you as well to Brittany and Lisa and Ann and the Follette School for this terrific discussion. My name is Nadia, as James mentioned, and I am the Chief of Staff to State Representative Francesca Hong. Our office represents the 76th Assembly District, which we are all sitting in right now. The 76 is certainly home to one of the youngest, most voter-engaged, diverse districts in the state. From a booming tech sector and a historic downtown to the UW-Madison campus and working-class pockets along the Isthmus, the economic, social, and demographic diversity of the 76 have lent to a significant political influence on issues like racial justice, economic justice, and most certainly climate justice. My own career so far has been refined by the political tradition of the 76, a climate organizer on UW's campus, a Senate candidate running on a climate platform 2 summers ago, a member of the Sustainable Madison Committee, and now as a staffer. The influence of youth mobilization has undoubtedly structured my worldview. What I learned in the grassroots here in the 76, I applied to crafting policy for the state of Wisconsin, especially as it relates to climate communication and mobilization. Those lessons have been instrumental in understanding that as politicians, as policymakers, as advocates, we do not hold all the answers. In fact, we rarely get it completely right most of the time. Our jobs as public servants must revolve around this idea that we are megaphones for our constituents, bringing their solutions to the table when they ask us to. I'll leave you to decide whether or not that is standard practice across the board in government, but from my time in the legislature and as an organizer, I've surmised that when it comes to climate communication, the most effective touch on 3 important points: building agency, democratizing information, and flexible messaging. Whether you're a scientist, a public official, a stakeholder, climate policy can be complex, technical, and rigid. It's not an easy feat to communicate a dense and varied phenomenon, especially to a broad audience. But when climate policy is created from the ground up, when it draws upon the lived experiences of those it pertains to, when it is delivered in accessible language and crafted in the spirit of inclusive discourse, then does it engage with those it'll help the most. Collaboration, one of the themes of this forum, is indeed the best vehicle of messaging, and all climate policy must be drafted in its spirit. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen often. In fact, there are many pitfalls in how we communicate climate change and in turn climate policy today. There is also a sort of inclusivity to the climate policy movement that disenfranchises and dissuades, that gatekeeps and gaslights. Climate change affects every one of us. Its ramifications are not limited to certain communities. And if we truly internalize this fact, the more effective communicators we become. We often have this self-serving internal dialogue, and I'm guilty of it as well, that because I care about something so much, I must make others care, which is a righteous sentiment in and of itself, but one that assumes that the other inherently doesn't or cannot care. Most people do not use or have access to mainstream verbiage to describe how an environmental crisis affects them. But all people deserve the tools to be agents in their own change. Once we build that agency, only then does effective, thorough, and rigorous climate justice happen. Thank you so much again for sharing space with me, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. And thank you to each of my panelists. Thank you very much. And I think, perhaps more than anything else, this panel is perhaps the most well-spoken and articulate group of young people I think I've had the pleasure of working with in a very long time. And so to begin a conversation with the question of how can young people become better communicators in this space is something I'm very eager to hear. Because frankly, I'm the oldest guy on this stage, and I don't understand TikTok. Or many of the other forms of communication that we're using right now in order to get messages out. But I'm very curious to know from each of you, how can young people improve their communication with other age groups, people of my generation, people of the other generations in this room, so that your messages are indeed being heard? What are the best ways that we can do that? And I'll open up that question and allow the first person who can raise their hand and give me an answer to that to start. Who would like to go? Stephanie, please.
Well, I think, like you mentioned, TikTok, right, is part of social media and is so key now. It's like the way we communicate, the way we show off our personalities, the way sometimes we express ourselves, the way we storytell about our lives and things that you don't get to see or hear if you didn't have those mediums. And of course, there's faults to it, being also a spreader of misinformation and among other evils within it. But I would say, like, TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook have all been tools used in the past by activists to mobilize. And that's where we, my organizations, are the most heavily involved to reach out to other students and other young people, and including like children. Like in the past, we have reached out to elementary schools and middle schools who wanted to participate in the climate strike, and we gave them a voice, a microphone to explain why they care. And with all this, I also want to mention the mental health part. While it's good to become a good communicator, that social media can also be draining, overwhelming. And so taking care of yourself and the way you can process how much information you want to receive in a day is very key to being a good communicator.
Thank you. Nada? Benji?
Okay.
Benji,
Yeah.
please.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm like right on the edge of millennial and Gen Z, and so like TikTok still, to me, I feel like I'm really not 23 when I'm looking at TikTok. I'm like, I have no idea how to use this app. Although I did try to make a TikTok with a quail once, and it didn't do too well. So if you want to check that out, feel free to give me a view, which are very low right now. But I think social media is probably a big reason why we're up here right now. I would not be here if it wasn't for social media. Primarily for me, Twitter has been very helpful in getting a message out. And the really interesting thing about social media that people don't realize is how much elected officials pay attention to social media. They hate being tagged in a post that calls them out, and they love being tagged in a post that compliments them. If we can use social media more proactively to call out elected officials or companies or whoever we're trying to get the attention of, and give them either bad press or good press, depending on the situation, that is really, really helpful. And I would say, switching gears from social media for a second, the one thing that really makes me angry about society today is the way that we have been misled in division by the national political leaders, whether it's Ted Cruz and that part of the conservative movement, or the equivalent on the left. We're constantly being pushed further and further away from each other, and further away from the middle, where most Americans actually are. And young people see that, and they're like, I don't want to mess with that. I don't want to get involved with politics because I don't believe in either one of these options. And so I'm not going to get involved. And my fear is that we're risking losing an entire generation's voice on politics because they are so unwilling to engage, and rightfully so, because of how divisive it is. We deserve better than that. And the entire country deserves better than that. We are being lied to by Fox News and CNN. We are being lied to by Donald Trump and Ted Cruz and the people on equivalent on the left. And we need to get above the fray as a people and try to push back a little bit and start mobilizing on things that we care about together. And I think climate change can be that force. I think this is the issue that we can stand together on and say, I don't care if you are Mike Gallagher in Wisconsin's 8th congressional district, or if you're, Ron Kind. We're going to work together to solve climate change. And if we can do that there, I think it can spread to other issues. And I think as a generation, we need to do better communication to inspire this almost politically lost generation to get engaged. Because even though every young person cares about climate change, there are very few people actually doing something about it because they don't want to mess with the divisiveness of politics. We need to make this issue hopeful. We need to make this issue unifying. We need to make this issue something that takes positive political action and entrepreneurship and innovation and new ideas and collaboration and cross-ideological communication. This is the generational opportunity to right the ship of American politics that has been sinking for numerous years. And I'm just proud that the people in this room are doing this, but we need thousands and thousands more. And it starts with each one of us saying that we're not going to tolerate the BS coming out of DC and the BS coming out of our national media, that we're going to actually stand above that and say, no, we're sick of that. And we're going to spread this climate positivity and climate hope that will guide us to a better planet.
Okay, thank you. Nada?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and those comments. I think this question is very interesting to me. I always joke that if I go back to school, I'd study, the influence of social media on social movements and policy, and how, public opinion and public sentiment has been made so accessible by open communication and social media, and how, these fields were kind of insulated before that. I think it's a double-edged sword as well, where the openness of social media has also, put us in, I think, information enclaves. My Twitter feed, I understand, is very much structured towards, what I want and my algorithm and what I believe. And it takes an extra step to break out of that. And I think when it comes to climate change and climate policy, we have, divisiveness that is kind of built on these misconceptions of what is happening. And maybe this lack of urgency because the truth and information isn't out. And so I think that the best thing that we can do is really diversify the voices that we listen to, the news sources that we, are exposed to, and the people that we follow. Because I think on the right and the left, the best way to kind of, better communication is to really, turn the light on different authorities in different communities that can bring about a true message of, this is what's happening with our planet and here's how we can fix it. And I think right now, in terms of the polarization of the climate crisis, has been because of its politicization. And so more voices we have outside of that to bring the facts about, I think the better, we can all be. And I think youth have an instrumental part to play in that. And I think that youth movements have been already doing that to an extent, where they've pushed the conversation on what is the status quo and how can we fight that? What have we been told and what can change and what is wrong about it? And I think older generations can really look to younger ones to show how that questioning, comes not from a place of wanting to burn everything down, but to really, lead with empathy and change with empathy and change for everyone. So I think for young people, improving our communication is doing what we've already been doing, which is questioning and refining and bettering ourselves.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's remarkable. I started my career in journalism with an effort to do that. Quite literally, the only thing that I could do to reach a broad audience was to work for a daily newspaper. Yeah. And I had the pleasure of actually writing some of the very first stories about Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And I was able to quit 3 years later because I saw that there was a tremendous pivot in terms of the direction that communication was taking. And I think that many of you are in a place right now where you can actually reach a much broader audience in many ways than many major news organizations. We just talked about the how. I think that it's also important that we talk about the what. And I'm curious to know, in your opinion, what are the best practices and strategies that we can incorporate into creating equitable community communication, so that we are indeed engaging an audience that is representative of the population as a whole and is equally being able to promote every voice in the room. How do we do that? Big question, I know, but I know we got answers.
Everyone look at me. I thought this question was really interesting because just like we talk about social media, there's other mediums too that we get to have all this information flowing through us, whether that is books, movies, right? Even the people that surround you with the information they tell you, that's all very important. And I'm a strong believer of what my mom has always said, tell me who you're with and I'll tell you who you are. For me, I will acknowledge first that climate change is a multifaceted issue that you have to look at through so many lenses. Just like Nada said, climate change is also the science aspect, but there's also the social justice aspect. And so with that, I want to like hammer in, like the importance of educating yourself. And I think that's a really important way to engage with others and effectively communicate about climate change. So first and foremost, we know that systems of suffering have been a medium to operate within our societies today. And so that includes white supremacy, sexism, and capitalism, oppressive capitalism. And with that, we have to incorporate solutions that if your climate justice work does not include social justice, that is not climate justice work. You have to incorporate solutions that mitigate in our strategies against racism, gender inequality, and reconstruction of an oppressive capitalistic system. Decolonize your mindset and educate yourself. Black and Indigenous people, again, like I mentioned earlier, were the ones who initiated this climate justice and environmental movement. And yet they're the ones left out of the conversation very often. So again, I will say that with the whole aspect of better to have strategies to communicate with others about climate change, it also involves you in educating yourself and what you know and what you don't know, because acknowledging also what you don't know is so essential to then look out for that information. Like you mentioned, having multiple and diverse inputs of information is also interesting to know what the other side believes or sees in this issue and what the other side then sees in this issue. It's all part of the image that you have to incorporate in your everyday lives.
Benji?
Yeah, I really think one of the most important things that we can do to solve climate change is to get out of the boxes that we kind of put ourselves in on social media and in life. To Nadia's point, it's really hard to get out of your own kind of bubble on social media. And you often forget that there are like other opinions out there. And then you see something you disagree with and you're like, oh, I'm going to unfollow that person, or, I'm just not even going to pay attention to it. I mean, my Twitter is a perfect example of this. I tend to kind of go against some conservative norms and some liberal norms. And so every time I do that, then the other side gets really mad and then they unfollow and they block and they send you death threats or whatever. It's a mess. And we have to get out of this mindset that like everything has to be our way. We have to get out of this mindset that every idea that is ours is good and every idea that is someone else's is bad. I grew up in a very privileged neighborhood, in a very privileged family. 4 years ago, I wouldn't have been willing to admit that because I didn't really understand the reality behind it. But now I do. And I also now realize the climate impact on social justice. I did not know that 4 years ago, but a few years ago, I had a few people really open up my eyes to it, and I got to go see some of those. I was lucky enough to see certain communities that have been harmed by climate change in an inequitable way firsthand. And now my mindset has changed because I exposed myself to that different mindset. And I wasn't willing to do that years ago. And I'm not saying that I'm like great for doing that. I'm just saying it was an amazing thing that I was lucky enough to see, was getting outside of that box and seeing that different opinion. And I think we have to do a better job of understanding one another and leading with empathy, because in a similar way that I didn't understand, I have grandparents who were climate skeptics for many, many years because that's all they had known. But once they realized that their grandson, someone they love and trust, was interested in climate action, now they're wholeheartedly supporting me and sending me $50 checks because they love what I'm doing. And they're conservative. But now they believe in climate change and they want action because someone who they identify with talked to them about it. We need to get out of our boxes and be willing to have those tough conversations, but also not judge those people that have those different mindsets in the way that I probably judged people who wrote social justice and climate change together. And now I realize that I was wrong. We have to do a better job of that. And I think a perfect example of this that I think isn't prevalent enough on the opposite side is that, and this is probably going to be a very controversial thing to say, I believe that we need to bring profit into the climate change conversation, because without profit, I don't believe that climate change can be solved. I went and toured a Native American tribe in Washington because they have some really amazing sustainability practices. And the thing that the chief tribal member told me was that the only reason they've been able to put those sustainable practices to use is because they've had profit in their town to be able to afford to actually pay for those. And in third world countries and in places across the world that are developing, when you're worried about putting food on the table and you're worried about providing for your family, you are not going to think about whether or not climate change is something that you need to prioritize. But when you're privileged and when you come at it from a place of an upper middle class and you've been exposed to the environment, then you talk about it a lot. And I live in Seattle where that's really prevalent. I mean, we have these like environmentalist, Prius loving, Americans who are very privileged to look at this issue. We need to be able to create a profitable world and an equitable world at the same time to be able to pay and profit off of being pro-climate. We need to have different innovations to make China and India and the United States and any country that is contributing to climate change actually be able to afford and implement pro-climate strategies. And that will come with an economic driver. And I think we forget that way too often. And it needs to create jobs, and it needs to put food on people's tables, and it needs to lift every single person in this globe up. And that's where I think when I say that in some climate, crowds, that's a very, very controversial message, and that will turn people off. And I think that's something similar to my ability to now see that social justice and climate are tied together, that if we just got out of each other's boxes and tried to actually see where people were coming from, we'd have a more holistic conversation on this, and we'd be a lot farther than we currently are.
Thank you. Nadia, can you add something to that?
Yeah, I think incorporating equitable community engagement is a high bar if we aren't looking at how the power of language really plays into that. And I think understanding that the language of climate scientists, the language of climate policymakers, the language of climate organizers sometimes misses each other, right? We have all these terminologies to describe the world around us, yet what's the purpose of labeling, these phenomenons if our neighbor can't understand it, when we talk about it? I think the best practice strategies in terms of equity is making sure that our language is accessible, especially around the issues that affect people, that don't have access to forums like this or all these books on climate change. And I think, to go further on that, maybe a big picture is that as a society, we need to understand that diversity doesn't always imply inclusion, and that when we have a number of people of color in a room or marginalized communities of any other demographic, understanding that their presence isn't enough in a system that has inherently subjugated them, and that in terms of really achieving equity, there has to be extra steps to make sure that we are all in the same playing field now. And I think a lot of the discomfort around equity has been, at least on the campaign and political side, this idea that equity is a separate plank, right? That no matter what political platform, if you have equity, if you don't, is a kind of, label on who you are as a politician. I think when it comes to climate change, we have to incorporate equity in every single facet of it. Transportation, needs equity, energy needs equity, green energy, needs a just transition. When it comes to labor, we need to look at how housing and sustainable development also incorporates equity, and equity of marginalized working class BIPOC individuals is kind of integral to making sure that climate mitigation moves from just that to climate justice. So I think the conversation needs to be restructured on this idea of where we are in terms of systemic issues. How are certain people disenfranchised, and how can we level the playing field, and then start talking about these larger, climate mitigation? Because I think climate mitigation without climate justice and understanding that, different things affect people different ways is how you're not going to get best practice strategies.
Thank you. I think I'm really loving this conversation because we're really talking about language, and we're talking about how exactly we're communicating these issues in such a way that we know what we're saying when we're saying it, and we're not using code words that make us think we're hearing something that isn't actually happening. You know, the fact that we use words like diversity, and a lot of people assume that that means quotas.
Yeah.
You know, that means that equity is going to deprive some segments of the population the things that they have, as opposed to making sure that everyone has an equal access to all of our resources. So ultimately, the question then is, how do we go about communicating what we mean in an effective way? You know, so that we are not using code words, that we are inclusive in our language as we are as inclusive in our intentions, to make sure that people really understand exactly what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about mitigating climate change. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we will be depriving people of the resources that they need to be not only successful, but to simply survive. And so I'm curious to know from each of you, just in terms of a policy perspective, I mean, what are the different types of climate change communications to receive by different constituencies, I mean, different segments of our population, that we can guide the conversation perhaps in a different way? How can we perhaps change the language that we're using to be, again, more inclusive of the entire audience so that we're not leaving anybody out? How do we make sure that as we're talking to people, they understand what we're saying?
I'll go first this time.
Please.
Well, this is going to sound really weird right away, but I've dated enough people, even at this young age of 23, to realize one really key thing. And that is, when you are in an argument with your significant other, the worst thing you can do is just keep going back and forth. The best thing you can do is to acknowledge the other person's feeling, the other person's opinion, and then tell them how you feel. To acknowledge the other person's feeling and opinion, and then communicate how you feel. Similar to how in this conversation, I talked about how I had been I opened my eyes to the importance of social justice, but then talked about how I also feel like profit's important. We need to be more willing to acknowledge the other person's opinion and see where they're coming from before trying to lay on them our opinion. And if it works in a relationship, and it has worked for me, thankfully, sometimes, it will work in politics, and we don't do enough of that. And when we're trying to communicate that, that's a huge problem. You know, if I have a conversation with someone from Kentucky, and I'm just trying to go back and forth without acknowledging their viewpoint about climate change, you're never going to get anywhere with that person who has that different opinion from Kentucky. And a really important personal example that I've seen is last fall, I did a road trip around the country. I did it's called the Electric Election Road Trip, and you can't say that 3 times fast. But we took a Tesla and we did 34 different states in 50 days to see different local climate initiatives that people were working on in different communities. And one of the more controversial ones that we saw was something happening at a coal plant in Utah. We went and toured a coal plant in Utah, and it's a county called Carbon County because they profit off of carbon emissions being, put into the atmosphere through the different energy productions that they have. And I got to meet with the people who worked at the coal facility, who told me that I was the first person from the environmental community to ever visit their county, the first person ever. And that they were so grateful that someone was coming there to listen to their concerns and understand where they were coming from and to acknowledge them as human beings. And then I got to learn that they believe in climate change and that they don't want to be seen as the problem. They want carbon emissions to be seen as the problem. Those people don't want to be seen as the problem because they're just trying to put food on their families' tables, and they're part of a generation of people that didn't even realize that what they were doing was harming the planet. And now they want to be a part of solutions, but no one's talking to them. No one's even showing up or trying to listen. And these people in Carbon County told me that they wanted to find ways to use coal for creating products or using coal to create clean energy, and use coal in a way that wasn't burning it, but using it for some other source. And they had all these ideas and they wanted them to be put out there, but no one was talking to them. And so we've been ignoring communities like that for so long. And the way that we communicate with them is by trying to listen to them and understanding where they're coming from. Just like, minorities and people in developing countries and tons of different communities also need to be listened to and need to feel heard. And if my story of Utah and coal country, USA, can be a showcase of where we can even move forward on climate action, then we can move forward anywhere. But we actually have to put in the effort, and we have to communicate with those people, and we have to try, and we have to make those people feel that they can be part of the conversation, and that if they have good ideas and they want to be there, they're not going to be told what to do from 2,000 miles away. They're actually going to be part of the conversation in the same room as everyone else.
Thank you. Nadia?
Yeah, I can answer this, I guess, from a government public policy perspective. But I think that when it comes to the receival of climate communication, polarization tends to happen, at least in my view, when political ownership is applied to climate policy. And that, there's definitely positives of radical political movements in terms of moving the conversation in places of governance to what is needed for really fast instrumental change when the status quo benefits from the opposite. I also think that polarization kind of adds this theme to solutions for our everyday problems that dissuade certain people. And so one way, when it comes to our office in the capital, the 76th district, we understand that our verbiage here as a young, probably one of the most progressive districts in the state, we understand that our verbiage isn't necessarily the one used in maybe a district in a rural area of Wisconsin. But we understand that the issues in themselves at the core are similar. I mean, we have, PFAS, or these forever chemical contaminations that happen to communities here in Madison and communities, across the state of Wisconsin, about 50, I believe. And it's a kind of this model of solutions first that I've seen from other really great offices in the building. Shout out to Senator Melissa Agard, who's in the audience, who, introduced one of the most comprehensive PFAS contamination, fighting package in the nation that really kind of relied on this idea of solutions first, right? How do we kind of work backwards and say, this is the issue that we all suffer from. Here's a solution that we have all drafted together. And you can kind of categorize that into whether you want to call it, part of a Green New Deal or climate justice, or whether it's just that piece of legislation. I think understanding that language is different, understanding that different constituencies have different conceptions of different issues, and then kind of playing backwards and saying, I'm not going to come tell you that a Green New Deal is the solution, but I'm going to say, here's the solution that I found that works for my constituents. What is the one that works for you, and can we meet in the middle? So I think when it comes to public policy, really understanding that bringing together kind of key stakeholders and legislators or people that make policy and, attacking a problem without necessarily bringing in those terminologies that might dissuade is sometimes an effective solution. And at the same time, understanding that, as leaders, we also have the responsibility to set the standard for action. And sometimes it does require making people uncomfortable, especially people that do not like the idea of equity if it, takes some of theirs, or they assume that it takes some of theirs. And so I guess that's my long way of saying that, those communication skills that we learned in elementary school are the most effective, which is just listening and finding compromise.
Thank you. And Stephanie.
Yeah, I think my colleagues really have the idea there that it's so important to find compromise and find middle ground. With that middle ground, you get to really connect with that person on a deeper level, because you're not just talking the surface level, what climate change is and why we are both concerned, but instead of like, how can we move this conversation forward, as we have mentioned. And as a youth activist, I've been on the other side of like being the constituent and talking to legislators, decision makers, people in power. I do want to remind that like, it's not about being tokenized. I often get, called into these meetings and forums, and I am the only woman of color, queer woman of color in that space. And it's just so difficult to then speak about, like, if a question about race is coming up about BIPOC communities, all the BIPOC communities, I cannot represent all of those. I am not a historical or an anthropology major in either case, but it's important to have then those grassroots activists to be put actually into place with positions of power, positions of decision making, because who knows better their problems of their society and their communities than the community itself? How is someone else that has never been in that community expected to solve their problems if they have never even experienced it in the first place? And so again, that hammers the whole idea of storytelling. As simple as it may sound, is a powerful tactic to get the message across to others.
Thank you. This has been a fabulous conversation, and I'd like to take this opportunity now to open it up to our audience. As I can imagine, there must be plenty of questions in the room, and I'd love to hear from many of you what you'd like to ask our panelists. This person here, please. Thank you. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. So all of you talked a lot about, including more diversity and equity and lifting up voices of people who aren't necessarily heard. And that being in the context of a very politically divided, not just politically, but divided in a lot of different ways, country. And so one of the things that I've been learning about is as people on the right, politically have begun to realize that climate change is a real issue, there has been this rising sentiment of blaming that climate change on poorer communities and blaming it on immigration and using tactics of ideologies of overpopulation and mass sterilization and that all of that. And so I was just wondering, how do you think that idea of eco-fascism can be combated, and how can we overcome that mindset? Yeah.
I can go first.
Please.
I think we also need to be careful of painting our system as something that can be fixed with these polite conversations when we know that we live in an inherently white supremacist country. And I think that, the Wisconsin state legislature is a really big indication where they introduced a ban on words like multiculturalism and racism and white supremacy and 100 others, in addition to critical race theory in public schools just last week or a week or 2 weeks ago. And I think as a society, this speaks to the idea that climate change and climate mitigation is a justice issue, and that if we don't solve those sins that we have as a country, settler colonialism, white supremacy, this battle against the working class, then climate change is just going to continue in different ways. And so I think those conversations are going to be difficult to have. I think they will polarize no matter what, especially for people that derive their power on stepping on other people. But I don't think we can shy away from it. And I think, looking at climate change, and I credit, people like Stephanie and Max Prestigiacomo climate activists in Madison that have influenced, change on the climate change task force, the governor's climate change task force to kind of utilize this terminology of climate justice, how we look at the whole system when it comes to climate change. And I'm hopeful that with those tough conversations that there's accountability for people that aren't at the table and that will be scapegoated for what's happening.
Please.
Can I add to that?
Please.
As an immigrant myself, I very much can relate to that pain of a whole generational trauma, racial trauma, the whole sterilization when women of color are trying to survive. It's a constant survival mode. It's never just peace. And so with that, I want to share a story about a time where I was doing an event. I'm going to show you my little book. It's the book, I share my immigration story, and it is immigrant students from James Madison Memorial, where I went to in high school, and we share our immigration stories, which much pain, but still heartfelt way to communicate to others where we're coming from. And so when I was explaining my story through an audience member tuned in and said a bunch of racial slurs towards me. And as much as I wanted to express those words and like say them in a way to just signal how like the gravity of the words that were being interchanged, it's still not something I wanted to like everyone to know and then spread around. And so with that whole experience that I got, I learned that as much as I want to educate others and I want others to care, not everyone will care. And I know that now to the bottom of my heart. And so I want to continue like speaking up and being heard, but also being supported. And so I talk to my women of color out there that are constantly raising their voice and calling other people out, that it's okay to take a break. It's okay to take care of yourself. And just like Nadia said, like, it's just important to know that not everyone will care. But at the same time, that doesn't mean your voice will be silenced. So as long as we all continue to contribute to the conversation and calling each other out and holding each other accountable, I think that's the best tactic to, again, get to the sins of this country that has been built in oppression and suffering.
If I could just quickly
Please.
answer that question. First of all, I really appreciate the question. And I think one thing just off the top of my head is that I personally haven't really heard of ecofascism. And coming from right of center perspective, I just want to share that with you because I think it's a really important question. However, the conservatives that we're working with in Congress and those in this room and those who are part of our organization, they're doing this because they actually see eye to eye with a lot of the people in this room. And even this the only congressional policy that's been passed on climate under the Biden administration so far was led by one of our allies, a Republican and a Democrat in the Senate, and it passed 92-8. And so I think the point I'm trying to make is that I think most, if not the largest majority possible of the right of center people on this issue are engaging in really good faith. People who would make arguments like that, I think, are in the very vocal minority of that conversation. And I think what we can do to your question of how do we combat that, if that is an issue, is to lift the people up who are right of center, who are working on it for good reasons. And I think you can tell based on who they're working with, the policies they're putting forward, the words that come out of their mouths, right? Supporting those people, even if we wouldn't vote for them, at least supporting them based on their climate work. I think if we do that, then it makes what the radical, eco-fascists I wrote down, and I'm going to look into that, it makes that less relevant. And I think to my point earlier, we're in a time, and I think we all need to check ourselves sometimes, where we hear the most alarming things in the media and on social media all the time. And a lot of times the things that are actually happening with the majority of people or the majority of conservatives or the majority of liberals or whatever isn't what we might see or hear about. And I think as a right of center person, the majority of conservatives that we're working with are doing this in awesome faith. We don't really hear about it. When that bill got passed this summer, we didn't hear about it. No one in here probably heard about it. Last year, at the end of 2020, the biggest investment in climate change happened in history. And it was a Republican and Democrat-led effort. No one heard about that because it's not divisive and it doesn't sell. And so I think there's a lot of progress being made right of center that we need, and left of center that we need to support and drown out kind of the extremist noise that you're alluding to.
Thank you. Another question?
We have a couple online.
Oh, great.
So I'll be asking questions on behalf of the people watching online.
People are watching online?
Yeah. yeah.
You're still watching an online event?
Yeah.
Good for you.
That's awesome. Great.
I know. But thank you everyone for coming in person online, and thank you for the great discussion. Do you mind if I ask two? We have several.
Please, go right ahead.
Okay. So first one, Parwat asks, historically, there's a precedence that in creating national parks, people living within the newly formed borders were ousted in favor of creating a, quote, pristine landscape. We know that the climate crisis is already here and impacting us all. When we fight for environmentalism on behalf of the environment, are we shifting the focus away from the people that live in that environment?
It's a big question. Just in terms of the work that I personally do, I'd like to just quickly answer this question in that, when we're talking about national park designation, especially if we're talking about, the big picturesque parks that we're all familiar with, we have to understand immediately that all the land in North America is stolen. And that we are constantly displacing people off the land in order to create these spaces that we're deemed for preservation. But on the flip side of all that too, I think that there's something to be said for the preservation of those spaces for future generations to enjoy. And typically with national park or national monument designation, what that also means is that these areas are being prevented from development. But unfortunately with that typically goes the people who had been protecting and preserving them for millennia. And so I think that one of the things that we really need to do is to make sure that as we are protecting these areas, we're also protecting the cultural sovereignty of the people who made them in many ways the places that they are today. And that there's this constant balance between how we can go about protecting these spaces, but at the same time, protecting the cultural integrity of the people who made these areas possible in the first place. And I think that as we do this work in terms of climate justice, that we also need to make sure that we are including the sake of humanity when it comes to the preservation of the natural resources as well. And that almost exclusively means the integrity of the people who were there first. Would anyone like to add something to that question?
I agree. That's great.
Well-
Nothing to add.
One quick thing to answer that question also, because I know I said putting the environment back into environmentalism. Part of environmental policy and climate policy is a cultural interest in the environment. And you have to change policy, but you also have to change culture. The most productive countries in the world in terms of lowering carbon emissions have the biggest focus on the environment from a cultural perspective. And the reason they have that cultural perspective is because they're exposed to the environment and they have a dear connection to it. They love it. They want to save it for future generations. If you don't have a connection to the environment, why would you fight for it? I mean, if you don't have a connection to nature and you don't have an experience in nature and you don't have a deep understanding of how lucky we are to be living on this planet, why would you fight for this planet? And so I understand the concept behind that question, but I also think the reason I care so much about it, maybe I'm super biased, but the reason I care so much about it is because the environment is where I'm at my most peaceful state of mind. It's where I feel the happiest. And I want my kids and my grandkids and their grandkids to enjoy that nature too. And we can't do that if climate change ruins our planet. And so if we don't expose people to the realities of the environment, whether that's a local park or a national park, and putting our connection back into it, we lose advocates really, really quickly.
Actually, I'll add one more thing. Sorry. I think it's really important to preface, at least from my part, that true climate justice is led by and includes Indigenous communities that are native to this land and, whose land we live on, and that true climate justice, acknowledges that their right is to have that land returned. So wanted to add that.
I think we have time for one more question. I'd like to favor the people who are in the audience. So please, this.
So Nadia, early on, you talked about building agency within historically excluded communities and helping empower to find solutions to issues that impact them. So I work for a small municipality in Iowa, and I want to know, what can small municipalities do to support this type of work? I feel like without addressing transportation and class issues and racism, I'm not going to get there.
Yeah.
And so I just want to know if you have any practical ideas about what to do, what I could do.
Yeah, I think the simplest and maybe the first step is making sure that your spaces, don't tokenize, but also include not just the people that are coming to you when you call out for communities to come by, to go to those people that, might not have time to put in public testimony because they're working, to make sure that information is accessible and extra accessible for some people. And I think when you'll find that when you really reach out to a very diverse economically, demographically, community on a certain issue, that it becomes easier that way. And I think a lot of our problems here on a municipal level in Madison come from this idea that if we put a program out there, so for example, like housing grants, that people who need them will come. When there is a deterioration of our informational channels, that more than likely a lot of people will never hear about that program, especially the people that need it the most. So making sure that we're not waiting when it comes to local municipalities for people to come with us, but making that extra step to make sure that our messaging is really cohesive, simple, and gets out to as many people as possible. And I think the most effective way is to literally door knock and say, hey, here's something that I think you should know. So from my experience, I think that's the simplest way. Thank you.
We've got 2 minutes for one last question.
So Benji, I appreciate that you acknowledged sort of your journey of learning about your privilege. I think another word for that is power or unrecognized power. And so I'm wondering from any of our panelists, how we think about engaging people that aren't recognizing their power in these dynamics around climate justice in the conversations around making transformational action.
Stephanie? You, Benji?
Yeah, well, first of all, I really appreciate the question. It's a really tough one because, it was tough for me, and I like to think I have a fairly open mind, and there's a lot of people who are not open-minded, or even if they are, won't be exposed to that. I think the best way to expose people to the privilege that they have is to take them outside of their comfort zone. There are places that I have been that have shaped the way that I think about that because I've seen it with my own eyes. A conversation doesn't really change that because people get defensive, and you're not going to change someone's mind on something of that severity without exposing them to it with their own eyes and ears, and meeting with the people who are still dealing with some of those issues today. A really transformational moment in my life was going and seeing Soweto, South Africa, and seeing kind of the blatant division of race in South Africa that I had never seen before, and the way that people were living based off of decades of oppression, and knowing that just a few decades ago, they were going through what we went through, a few decades before that. And that really opened my eyes to, wow, that's how it is here. We're just maybe a little accelerated. And then many things after that. But my point of saying that is not everyone's going to be able to go to Soweto, South Africa, right? To see that. That was a school trip, but it's going to be exposing people to those things. And that is tough. And generationally, I think that the bright side is that the younger generation kind of gets it. By and large, we're all kind of on board with the fact that we have to become more equitable. With older generations, there's some where it's going to be hard to expose them to those realities and change their minds. But having compassionate conversations like the ones I had with my grandparents and parents last summer about Black Lives Matter, that's the most we can do at this point. And I think exposure and honest conversations without being angry and judging them for maybe having different opinions is the best way, but it's really tough.
One short thing, I think allyship needs to be actionable and not just a badge that some white people wear, where it's like, I believe that you're equal to me, but I'm not going to do the extra work to make sure that my colleagues who see me as a bigger authority than people of color because racism plays into it, I'm going to ignore that part of my job. And I think that, each one of us, no matter what our skin color is, when it comes to our allyship with communities that don't look like us, we need to make sure that we are, walking the walk and not just talking it. And I think it gets so much easier to bridge those divides when we have that human to human kind of experience and that storytelling, but oftentimes that burden is put on communities of color and it's oftentimes dangerous or just ineffective. So making sure that if you are privileged, that you are kind of carrying that torch forward, I think is the best way we can all collectively solve this.
Can I add in something?
Please.
So the first way I like to address someone who wants to know more how to educate themselves in systems of power and how what identities they hold there may be in certain spaces oppressed or privileged. I always remind them to look into the theory of circle of socialization. And so you first are born and you don't choose your family, you don't choose your community where you're born at. Your circle of socialization is limited. But then you can be going to college and having all this access to education, and you're told otherwise of things that you thought were the norm from where you were born. And that comes in conflict. You're conflicted of things that you've always been told when you were little, and then you get to a stage in your life where you're like, I could either go back to what I was told or move forward with what I have learned. And if you move forward to something that is progressive, more inclusive, into what you think is more humane to think about, you can go into the circle of liberation. And that is into a decolonized mindset. And that takes a lot of work personally. So that's why I was always throughout my responses hammering in mental health, self-love is the best love, because this work will take a lot within your mindset, within yourself, because you will know that even the things that you do unconscious can be subjective and adding on to white supremacy, racism, capitalism, whatever the case may be. And so some two good books that I like to start people off are The Color of Law, talks about redlining with communities of color, and Toxic Communities by Rosetta E. Taylor. And these are just two introductory books that I always recommend for people to know more about environmental justice and how communities of color have initiated this conversation, have been in this movement for long enough before we even started to think that climate crisis was really a big issue. So again, I just want to remind that white bodies in the space, white people in this space must put in the work to educate themselves and may not always understand that education from a person of color may be a privilege. It is a privilege. We are not entitled to explain to you systems of oppression. And so for that reason, one must educate yourself.
And in the spirit of self-education, thank you very much for each of our panelists today. And thank you very much for being in the audience. It's been my pleasure to moderate this discussion, and I wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.